Welcome back to You Talk, We Listen, and a big shout out to our sponsor, OtisWho Network, for making this deep dive possible.
You sent us some research on a potential breakthrough in the fight against HIV and AIDS. And I got to say, it's pretty mind-blowing stuff. We're talking about a shot, a twice-a-year shot. That could potentially prevent HIV infection. The studies are showing it's 100% effective in women and nearly as effective in men. I mean, wow.
Right, it is remarkable. And what makes it even more impactful is the timing. UNAIDS, or the Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS, has reported that AIDS-related deaths are at their lowest point since 2004. This new development with the shot feels like it could be a major turning point.
Okay, so before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's break this down for our listeners. First off, what exactly is this shot?
It's called lenacapavir. It's also known by the brand name Sunlenca. The pharmaceutical company Gilead makes it. Interestingly, lenacapavir is already being used in some countries to treat people who are already living with HIV, but now the research is shifting to explore its potential as a preventative measure. So it's almost like we're talking about a vaccine for HIV, which is a huge GE leap forward from the daily pills or other preventative methods people are currently using. Twice a year. That's incredible. Think about the impact that could have on people's lives.
Exactly. And that's why this is such a big deal. Current prevention methods, while effective, aren't always practical or accessible. Condoms, daily pills, life happens and things get missed. But a shot, twice a year, could remove a lot of those barriers, especially for marginalized groups who might face stigma or fear when it comes to seeking health care.
The research you sent in included a really powerful story that illustrates this point perfectly. It's about a man named Luis Ruvalcaba. Can you tell us about him?
Of course. Luis is a 32-year-old man from Guadalajara, Mexico. He participated in the lenacapavir study and shared that he was really hesitant to ask for daily pills because of the discrimination he feared as a gay man. But this shot, he said, gave him a sense of protection and peace of mind that he just wasn't getting before. His story is a powerful reminder that medical advancements are only as good as their reach.
His story is incredibly moving.
Right.
It really makes you think about the human impact of all this. But it also brings up a concerning issue that the research highlighted. Equal access to this potentially life-saving shot isn't a given.
Unfortunately, you're right. There's a significant disparity in who will have access to this shot. Gilead has committed to making cheaper, generic versions of lenacapavir available in 120 lower-income countries, mostly in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. But they've excluded almost all of Latin America from this deal, even though infection rates are on the rise there.
Now, this is where things get a little complicated. I mean, if Gilead is offering generics in some regions, why not Latin America? It seems counterintuitive. What are the possible consequences of this decision?
Well, excluding Latin America from access to these cheaper generics risks missing a crucial window to control the spread of the virus there, even if rates aren't as high as in other regions. If we look back at the history of HIV and AIDS treatment access, we see this pattern of disparity repeating itself, and unfortunately, that has led to preventable suffering and loss of life. It's a mistake we can't afford to make again.
It seems almost absurd, doesn't it? To have a solution but not fully utilize it, it feels like we're hitting a wall when it comes to access. And to make matters worse, the research highlighted this crazy cost difference between the brand name and the generic versions.
Yes, the difference is staggering. In some countries, Sunlenca, the brand name version, can cost over $40,000 per year. But experts estimate that if production expands to cover 10 million people, the generic versions could be produced for as little as $40 per treatment.
Wow.
$40 versus $40,000, you're talking about a 1,000-fold difference. That's insane. What are the ethical implications of a price gap that massive? Well, from an economic standpoint, the high price of drugs like this creates a significant barrier to both treatment and prevention, especially in low and middle-income countries. But from an ethical perspective, it raises the question of whether prioritizing profit over global health is the right approach.
It's a tough situation, that's for sure. But the research did mention some potential solutions being explored.
Right.
But the research did mention some potential solutions being explored, right?
Yes, advocacy groups are actively putting pressure on Gilead to expand access to generic lenacapavir, especially in Latin America. And some experts are suggesting that countries like Brazil and Mexico could try a more radical approach by issuing what are called compulsory licenses.
Okay, hold on. I think we need to explain what a compulsory license is because I'm not sure everyone is familiar with that term.
You're right. Essentially, a compulsory license allows a country to ovocate a patent during a health crisis. It lets them permit the production and distribution of generic versions of a drug without getting consent from the patent holder.
So it's kind of a controversial move, but could be a game changer in a situation like this, right?
Exactly. And we actually have a recent example of this in action this past April. Colombia issued its first ever compulsory license for an HIV treatment called Tivicay. It was a bold move, and it shows that some countries are willing to challenge the status quo to ensure their citizens have access to life-saving medications.
It's interesting to see how different players are stepping up to address this issue. Advocacy groups, governments, it feels like there's a real push for change.
Yeah.
But speaking of key players, the research you sent in also mentioned another preventative HIV shot called Apertude, developed by Vive Healthcare. It's showing some really promising results as well. Can you tell me more about it?
Apertude is also administered as a bi-monthly injection and boasts an effectiveness rate of about 80 to 90%, which is definitely significant, but unfortunately, just like with Sunlenca, we're running into the same accessibility roadblocks.
So even with this alternative option, the same access issues persist.
Sadly, yes, Viviv Healthcare has made a generic version of Apertude available in roughly 90 countries. But again, much of Latin America is excluded even in the countries where it is available. The cost can be an insurmountable hurdle in some middle-income nations. It costs roughly $1,500 per year, which is simply unaffordable for many.
It's frustrating that this seems to be a recurring theme. It feels like we're having the same conversation over and over again. It doesn't matter which promising preventative measure is being discussed. We keep running into this wall of limited access.
You've hit the nail on the head. You provided a quote from Asia Russell, the executive director of Health Gap, which is an advocacy group. She stated that with over 1 million new HIV infections globally each year, our current prevention methods simply aren't enough.
Right, we can develop all these groundbreaking treatments, but if people can't get them,
Huh.
what's the point? It feels like we're failing on a fundamental level.
Her point exactly. It's a stark reminder that scientific progress alone is not enough. We need equitable distribution and affordability if we truly want to see a lasting impact.
So what can we do to change things? What steps can be taken to address these deeply ingrained access barriers?
There are several avenues being explored. Continuous advocacy and putting pressure on pharmaceutical companies to expand their generic drug programs is one approach. But some experts are proposing more radical solutions, like encouraging countries to use compulsory licensing, as Colombia did with Tivicay.
Those compulsory licenses seem like they could be a powerful tool, but they must also be pretty controversial, right?
Of course, there's a delicate balance to strike between encouraging pharmaceutical companies to innovate and ensuring people can afford these life-saving medications. Compulsory licensing is tricky. It can be a lifesaver for people who need cheaper generics, but it might also discourage companies from researching and developing new drugs if they fear their patents won't be protected.
It's a tough situation, no doubt.
Oh.
What about UNAIDS? What role are they playing in advocating for wider access to these preventative treatments?
UNAIDS is a strong advocate for fair and equal access to both HIV prevention and treatment. Winnie Bynema, their executive director, has been very vocal about the need for lenacapavir to reach the people who need it most no matter where they live. She's called on Gilead to reconsider their decision to exclude Latin America from their generic drug program and has emphasized how important global collaboration is in tackling the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
That makes sense. So we have these advocacy groups, international organizations like UNAIDS and even governments pushing for change. But what about the people on the ground who are directly impacted by these access issues? What can they do?
That's an excellent question. Individuals have a crucial role to play in raising awareness, mobilizing communities, and demanding change. We see examples of this in the research you shared. Both Luis Rubalcaba, who participated in the lenacapavir study, and Hanya Danielle Torres, a trans woman who also participated, expressed their desire for their governments to make these shots accessible. Their voices, and the voices of countless others living with or at risk of HIV, hold immense power. They can shape public opinion, influence policy decisions, and ultimately push for a more just and equitable healthcare system.
Their stories are a powerful reminder that change often begins at the grassroots level. And speaking of those in the front lines, I know the research highlighted a striking perspective from a leading AIDS expert, Dr. Salim Abdul Karim. Can you tell us about his take on lenacapavir?
Yes, Dr. Karim, who works at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, stated that in all his years working in the field, he'd never encountered a drug that seemed as effective as lenacapavir in preventing HIV. His statement carries a lot of weight coming from someone with his expertise and experience.
That's a powerful statement for sure.
Absolutely. And what's especially poignant is the question he poses after making that statement. He essentially asks, now how do we get it to everyone who needs it?
Wow, such a simple question, but it really cuts to the heart of the matter.
Exactly. He's laid out the core challenge we're facing. We have this potential game changer, something that could dramatically alter the course of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, but its effectiveness depends entirely on our ability to ensure everyone has equal access. That's the real battle we're fighting now, the fight to bridge the gap between this amazing scientific advancement and actually getting it into people's hands.
That brings us back to the core mission of this deep dive, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
To take all this information you've shared, distill it down to the key takeaways, and really grasp the significance of what these developments could mean for the future. We're clearly on the verge of a major breakthrough in the fight against AIDS, but we're also at a crucial point where the decisions we make today will have a huge impact on global health.
You've summarized it perfectly. We have the scientific knowledge, the technology, and potential solutions. The real question is, will we rise to the occasion and make the right choices? Will we ensure these incredible advancements benefit everyone, everywhere? That's the challenge and the opportunity that we face.
It's inspiring to hear about all the progress being made and to realize just how much potential there is to make a real difference in the fight against HIV and AIDS. But I'm curious, is there anything in particular that surprised you during this deep dive into the research? Something that maybe you weren't expecting or that challenged your previous assumptions?
What struck me was the level of innovation happening right now, especially in the realm of prevention. We've moved so far beyond the traditional methods of condoms and abstinence-only education. We're talking about injectables like lenacapavir pre-exposure prophylaxis or pre-EP, which is a daily pill that can significantly reduce the risk of HIV infection, and even gene editing therapies that are showing promise. The sheer range of options being explored is truly remarkable.
It's like we're entering a new era of HIV prevention, one where people have more choices and more control over their own health. But with all these options, how do individuals navigate those choices and figure out what's best for them?
That's where healthcare providers play a vital role. They need to be equipped to provide comprehensive counseling and education on all the available options. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. What works for one person might not be suitable for another individual, needs risk factors, and even personal preferences come into play.
So it's about empowering people to make informed decisions about their own health in consultation with their healthcare providers.
Precisely. And it goes beyond just the medical aspects. There's also a need for greater societal understanding and acceptance of these different prevention methods. We need to break down the stigma that surrounds HIV and create an environment where people feel comfortable discussing their options openly and honestly.
That makes sense. Stigma often thrives in silence. The more we talk about HIV prevention, the more we normalize it, and the less power stigma has to hold people back from seeking the care they need.
Exactly. And that's where I think the voices of people living with HIV are so crucial. Their lived experiences, their stories, their advocacy, it's all essential in challenging misconceptions and driving positive change.
We need to amplify those voices, don't we? It's not just about scientists and policymakers making decisions in a vacuum. It's about listening to and learning from the people who are most directly impacted by this epidemic.
Absolutely. Their insights are invaluable in shaping effective policies and interventions.
You know, listening to you talk about all this, I can't help but feel a surge of optimism. It sounds like we have all the pieces of the puzzle, and we're finally starting to put them together in a meaningful way.
There's definitely cause for optimism. The progress that's been made in the fight against HIV/AIDS is truly remarkable, but we can't afford to become complacent. There's still a long way to go, and the fight is far from over.
That brings to mind your final thought-provoking question, the one we always like to leave our listeners with. What is it you want them to ponder after this deep dive?
It's a question that lingers in my mind after everything we've discussed. If we have the potential to end the HIV/AIDS epidemic in our lifetime, what will it take to make that a reality? What role can each of us play in making that vision a reality?
What a powerful question to end on. It's a call to action. Isn't it a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be informed, to be engaged, and to advocate for a world where everyone has the opportunity to live a long, healthy, and fulfilling life free from the threat of HIV and AIDS?
You put it beautifully.
Well, thank you for joining me on this deep dive. It's been an incredibly insightful and inspiring conversation.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, thank you for being part of this journey with us. We encourage you to continue exploring these issues, to stay informed, and to use your voices to push for a more just and equitable world for everyone.